The NBA playoffs are here, and I'm getting my bets in on FanDuel. Talk to me, Chuck GPT. What do you know?
All sorts of interesting stuff, even Charles Barkley's greatest fear.
Hey, nobody needs to know that.
New customers bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets if you win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. 21 plus and present in Virginia. Must be first online real money wager. $5 deposit required. Bonus issued is non-withdrawable bonus bets that expires 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Welcome back to another special episode of Beat Check with the Oregonian, where we look back at the case of Kyron Horman, the 7-year-old boy who disappeared from Portland's Skyline Elementary School in June 2010. I'm Julie Abenson, engagement editor here at the Oregonian. I'm here with social media producer Destiny Johnson. Today, we're joined by crime and courts reporter Maxine Bernstein, who covered the case extensively at the time.
Maxine Bernstein, you're our crime and court reporter. You were heavily involved in the coverage of the Kyron Horman case when it happened back in 2010. Do you recall when you knew this case was like atypical, when you understood that this response was very large and this was going to be a big deal?
It was almost from the start of the missing persons call, June 4th, 2010. This case really stood out because every year there's hundreds of thousands of missing children reports. But what set this case apart was that the child was missing from a school. And according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, that occurs in less than 2% of missing person cases. And I think it was just such a gripping, devastating story because such a innocent 7-year-old boy, we saw photos of him that his stepmom posted on Facebook that very day of him smiling with his gap tooth smile in front of his science fair project with a CSI shirt on. And to think, how this boy just suddenly vanished from a school was just gripping to not only people in Portland, Multnomah County, but quickly across the country. And it drew the largest search and rescue operation. It set off the largest search and rescue operation. So we hadn't seen anything like that before. There were volunteers that came in from Washington and California, as well as Oregon. People on foot were searching, as well as planes, search volunteers, teams with cadaver sniffing dogs. And it was such a vast area, heavily forested area. This wasn't right in a center city, but such a rural, northwest part of Portland in a heavily forested area. So from the get-go, there was a lot of attention to this case and also widespread media attention.
What a lot of people I don't think understand about like the landscape of Portland is that you can be within a block of a very populated city and then suddenly turn around in the next block. It is trees as far as you can see. People think it's really, really urban here, and it is in a lot of ways, but also there's so much forest around. So it's a great point to make.
Looking back 15 years, walk us through. How did you get assigned to this case? What else were you doing that day? Did you just drop everything to go and do this?
So I was covering Portland Police Bureau and crime in the city. So when there's a report of a missing child from a school, that immediately draws me to cover it. And so this was 15 years ago. I don't remember the exact day, but my focus was on the investigation side of this case and trying to figure out from police, sheriffs, federal law enforcement, what they knew and what they were doing. And we really mobilized our whole breaking news team, including interns. It was in the summer, in June. So we just, we sent people to the Kyron home. We sent people to the school and covering the searches. I remember going to early news conferences at a church right across the street from the school, and the news conferences were led by Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. And there was an early news conference with both the biological parents of Kyron and his stepmom and stepdad. So I was basically trying to mine my law enforcement sources to figure out what happened, what they were doing, and what they were looking for. And I continued to follow the investigation through the early searches and interviews there were about 300 students at Skyline. They described the Skyline School as ground zero. And in those first few days, law enforcement detectives, including FBI agents, were trying to determine who was at the school at the time Kyron went missing, and trying to contact everyone and set up interviews with students as young as, his fellow second graders, as well as the faculty and staff. And they were even looking at photos to try to determine what cars were in the parking lot of the school at the very beginning to identify who was there. They were also trying to profile his family and trying to figure out everyone and identify everyone who may have had contact with this boy, and interview them as well. So those were the early days. Plus, other reporters were following and covering the ground searches in this, heavily forested, wooded area. And initially the searches were around the school, obviously, and around the Horman home. And then that developed and expanded to Sauvie Island.
How long did it take before national press started to show up? I imagine early on it was just local media.
I think early on, but it was very quickly. There was a wall of hope that emerged outside the school on a fence with, everyone leaving flowers or remembrances or teddy bears, notes. So it was very early on that I recall that there were, their TV trucks with the just sort of stationed out there. And then as we learned more about this blended family of Kyrons, and some of the family dynamics, I think that also attracted, national press, because there were some unusual developments as the investigation continued.
Yeah, that's putting it lightly. I think that's one of the reasons why people still really talk about this case. It's very much in the community consciousness. And I wanted to know, as a reporter who's, done her time in breaking news, do you think about this case personally? Like, I don't think that the public really understands the way that, journalists experience breaking news. We go from one traumatic event to the other, and we live this human experience, and then we go and live the next one. Does this case stick with you at all?
Sure. Obviously it does. I'm a parent. I have 2 boys. At the time in 2010, my oldest was 6 years old. He was just a year younger than Kyron. So of course, as I'm reporting and I'm focusing on the story at hand, I can't imagine being a parent and having your child disappear with no trace. So yeah, I think that was what was so disturbing and gripping and drew national interest in this story because there was no physical trace of this child. And so I recall a year later, or it wasn't even a year later, it was 6 months later, I interviewed Multnomah County Sheriff at the time, Dan Staten, at a 6-month point. And, at the very end of the interview, he mentioned his 7-year-old daughter who kept asking him, Daddy, when are you going to find Kyron? So yeah, you can't help but think about, you expect when you bring your child to school that they'll be safe. So, and this case, I think, changed a number of practices at Portland Public Schools. In particular, the sheriff focused on the vital 6 hours that they missed in this investigation. And the stepmom had brought Kyron to the school for early morning science fair, arriving around 8 or so. And she told authorities she last saw him at 8:45 walking to his classroom. He was not in class that day. He was not discovered missing until 6 hours later, when his stepmom and father, waiting for him to arrive back home by school bus, are waiting at 3:30 and he doesn't get off the bus. They alert the school, and the school secretary then calls 911 at about 3:45. So the sheriff just focused on those lost 6 hours that were key, that would have been key to try to retrace his tracks or where he ended up. And that was a huge loss in this investigation. And I think that changed PPS. If there's a student absent, I know from being a parent of a student who sometimes is absent, I get the robocall right away that your student's absent this period. And that didn't happen. And that's been a change of policy as a result.
Speaking of sort of thinking back on this case over the years, I know we're not legal experts, and that's not what I'm asking you for here, but is there some nugget of the case that you like, man, I really wish we knew the answer? Obviously, we all wish we knew where Kyron was and what happened to him. But is there something about the case that just hit you in your little, I don't know, journalism brain and just sort of stuck with you?
Well, 6 months into the case, I was allowed to see the so-called sheriff's war room. And it was basically where they were, it was the location where the multi-agency task force met to investigate the case as the months wore on. And at that time, there was this huge enlarged photo of Kyron, from the science fair in front of his science fair project. There were metal shelves that held like more than 60 white binders of reports on the conference table in this bare bones conference room. There were 2 laptops that were open with contained FBI software that was sorting more than 4,000 tips. And then in a room next door were these stacks of maps, on the walls, on the tables, so pinpointing areas they had searched or not searched. And I recall, the sheriff at that time saying that investigators suspected that more than one person might have been involved in Kyron's disappearance, and that more than one crime was suspected of having occurred. And that was the which I broke, was the alleged murder for hire scheme that the stepmother was alleged to have engaged a landscaper in to get rid of her husband about 6 to 7 months before Kyron disappeared. She was never criminally charged with that, but it became an issue that led Kyron Horman to move out of the home, file for divorce, and seek a restraining order against Terry Horman, his wife at the time, Kyron's stepmom. And then they, allege that he was obviously he's missing. Was he kidnapped? Was he abducted? Was he passed off to someone and moved out of the country? These were all, was he a victim of human trafficking? These were all questions that detectives were raising. And while it was clear they didn't identify a suspect and they never named a person of interest, it was clear they were focused on stepmom and her associates. But yet it was almost after the fact I felt that they had FBI agents and detectives identify all the sex offenders and child abusers in the radius of Skyline School and the Horman home, because that's part of any investigation when a child is missing. And so I don't know if that was delayed or not, but I got a sense that was. But, there was, at no point did they find any physical evidence of this child. And there's been prosecutions that have occurred in Multnomah County in Oregon when no body has been recovered. But in a child missing case, it's even more difficult because a child doesn't leave any other prints through a phone or email or electronic prints. That's what makes this, so difficult. And then there was obviously the dynamic between his biological mom and his father. Each approached this case differently. Desiree was, out in the public with her husband and really trying to maintain focus, and has been, as you would hope any mother would who's missing their kid, trying to ensure investigators don't give up and remain focused on her son's disappearance. Kane was, he did the same in his own way and held fundraisers and car washes, but it was a little more reserved in that respect. And the whole investigation involving, there were just some really unusual facts to come out regarding the stepmom. I mean, the alleged murder for hire plot involving the landscaper. And then later investigators were focusing on a friend of hers, Dee Dee Spicer, who apparently was helping out at a nursery gardening that day. And initially, investigators felt there was this time period during the lunch hour where she was unaccounted for. And ultimately, I believe she, ended up testifying before a grand jury. No charges were brought. And then later, there was information from investigators that Terry was somehow exchanging sexual text messages or messages with a former high school friend of Kane's. I mean, there was just really some bizarre developments that came out along as months progressed. And then Desiree, I'm really not answering your question. I'm just going off here. But Desiree, filed her own 2 years later, 2 years after her son disappeared with no information, no arrest. She hired a prominent civil rights lawyer and filed a civil suit alleging that the stepmom kidnapped her son and urging a judge to compel her, Terry, to either say what she had, if she had, where Kyron was, or divulge where they could find him. Ultimately, she chose to drop that suit, facing pressure from the investigators, who were concerned it might interfere with the investigation. So there were just some really unusual turns and twists in this case, but it's remarkable that, here we are 15 years later, and there's been no physical evidence unearthed of Kyron. I recall the sheriff's captain at the time was Jason Gates. He at the time said, this is not going to be a sprint. This is going to be a marathon. But Lord, it's like become an Ironman. I mean, it's sad, and the fellow students of Kyron, have graduated high school. That's just stunning and disturbing to think that.
So you mentioned the lack of physical evidence in this extended period of time. Recently, the new Multnomah County District Attorney, Nathan Vasquez, made a public statement that they're going to revisit this case. Are there new investigative techniques or technology or more resources that you think they could bring in and potentially, with more attention and focus on the case, come to some sort of breakthrough? What would that look like, and what do you expect might come from this?
Yeah, well, DA Vasquez, as part of his campaign, he had promised that he would look at this case again, and he's following through on that. So over the years, I know with other cases have resulted in significant breakthroughs because of improvements in DNA technology. So I would expect investigators to consider that and consider where they can use that. There also may be ways to, there's digital footprints that they might go back and find that they didn't examine in the past, or just a fresh look at the material that was obtained from subpoenas in the past. I know they were looking at emails of the stepmom and cell phone ping towers to determine where she was between those 6 hours that he was not in class and was reported missing. And yeah, I would think, they bring in, at the time, they brought in FBI profilers who tried to, review the evidence they had at the time and consider and evaluate leads and try to steer investigators to areas that they might not have considered in the past. So they might do that as well again now.
Yeah, the landscape of even just DNA evidence of the last 15 years has changed greatly. My mom's a crime scene technician. She teaches. She talks a lot about this stuff, and it's very interesting. But it does mean that there is a chance. There's always a chance. I mean, look at the way genetic genealogy, that's not playing a part here, but the way that technology is advanced, and we've used it in sort of a crime setting. So I think that's really great. Is there anything that you want people to know about you as a reporter in reference to this case, or anything, something you'd like to clear up, or you want people to know about your experience?
No, it's just, it was a seminal case, earlier in my career. And of course, if anyone has any information, would love to hear from them. I know over time I heard from lots of people, even psychics, who were also calling investigators and trying to steer them to certain areas to search. But yeah, obviously it's an important case. It's important to the family. I've seen firsthand how it impacted this family, and fellow students and staff. If there's anyone has information or that they don't think has been considered, I would love to hear it.
Thanks so much for listening to our conversation today. You can find more at OregonLive.com. For the latest on the Kyron Horman case, go to www.OregonLive.com/topic/Kyron-Horman. Join us next time for another episode of Beat Check.
If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is a subscription to the Oregonian /Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.